Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My colleagues, Kalyn, Wulatin, and Khalil and I, Khalil El-Saghir, are happy to facilitate this presentation on supporting multilingual learner and as part of the Wayne Risa Summer Learning Blitz. And here is our Wayne Risa Multilingual Consultants team. Our colleague Zainab Hidous is not part of this, but she's part of the team also.
And hi, I'm Kalyn Wulatin. Glad to have you here this afternoon.
Thank you, Kalyn. And first, if you have not done so using the link in the chat, please use the QR code to fill out the attendance form. Our agenda is very simple, as we will be focusing on two elements that we deem extremely important for supporting multilingual learners. And we have two items: change and asset-based thinking, and research-based best practices. And without further ado, let's start with the first part: change and asset-based thinking. This anonymous quote perfectly captures the state of mind of most of us when it comes to ideas, thoughts, opinions, beliefs, and practices. We all have a natural tendency to always love, hence cling to, what we know and what we do. Even though this is good when it comes to our kids and loved ones, it poses a great challenge when it comes to learning and growth, both of which require change. So why do people resist change? Scientific and social research shows that we have an evolutionary biological tendency to preserving energy. Any change in thought or practice requires energy. Our brain continuously leads us to do the things we do, as we always do, to preserve energy, whether sitting in the same spot on the same couch, taking the same route to work, using the same vocabulary in our repertoire, or repeat the same activity every day in the classroom. Physically and psychologically, we prefer taking the path of least resistance. Why exerting more time and effort to choose a path that requires overcoming obstacles, known or unknown ones? So we stick to the famous rule as we see it: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Even when things are shattered, but we either don't see them as such, or we don't want to see them so. Again, mostly due to behavioral and psychological reasons. We also resist change when there isn't enough incentives to change. No incentives usually means no motivation to do something. In behavioral psychology, this is something that is referred to as fuels. On the flip side of that is when there are too many obstacles and steps, which is referred to as frictions. We also resist change due to frictions. And here is what behavioral psychology tells us about fuels and frictions. Fuels are the forces that elevate and enhance the appeal of a new idea or initiative. Incentives, such as incentives, emotional appeals, data, evidence. So if we want to convince a teacher or group of teachers or a district that this is a good practice, we bring data, we show evidence, and we try to play on those emotions and bring more incentives, and in order to make that practice part of the pedagogy in that district or school or classrooms. On the other side, frictions are the psychological forces that resist change and learning new systems, working with different people, changing the workplace environment, putting forth more time and effort. And what we always hear, you're adding to my plate to do something more. And we hear this all the time. And it is true that instead of looking at what is stopping us from adopting new ideas or new practice, we just add more to what is there, and that is not healthy at all, and that's what causes frictions, hence stop change from happening. And what we see is that most organizations and individuals tend to focus more on fuel component of the equation rather than on friction. So if we tell a teacher, this is a good practice, and to do it here, we're giving you more time or money maybe, or whatever, that we add more fuel to it instead of thinking, okay, what the staff need in order to remove those frictions that would stop them from moving forward with that change. So adding fuel is not always a good practice in order to really get the change happening. And so how do we ensure incorporating asset-based approach when working with multilingual learners? These are some of the most important elements that we identified, examining your own language ideologies. And each and every one of us have language ideologies. And here in the US, it is very acute to think that everyone must speak English, for example. And there is a power when it comes to using English instead of other languages. So when we say use native language in the classroom, for decades that has been resisted. And if we look at the laws from even recent, the ESSA and the No Child Left Behind before that, and we look at those laws, and we see that across the board, no matter how much the change happening, there is always English, English, English. Even when it comes to our multilingual learners, what do we call them? We call them English learners. And this is why we changed. In RISA, we shifted from that deficit-based terminology, and we will go over that in a short time. So questioning your own language ideology and examining those ideologies is the first step in order to really succeed in incorporating asset-based approach in multilingual learners. Supporting and advocating for the goals and aspirations of the multilingual learners and their families. We always say that this is the goal of teaching, and these are the academic goals of the students. We set those goals, but do we ask the students themselves and their families, what are their goals and aspirations? We need to do that. We need to really think in terms of student-centered. We always say student-centered. What about multilingual learners-centered education? We need to ask and advocate for those goals and aspirations of the multilingual learners and their families. If they want to keep their native language and preserve their native language, and we must support that. Learning about, appreciating, and incorporating multilingual families' fund of knowledge. It's not only about the language, it's about all the knowledge and experiences that those families bring to the fore, bring to the experience. And we need to really show appreciation of those fund of knowledge that the families bring in, and learn about them. And based on our experiences, supporting PTA and PTO and in the school is a great way to really learn about those fund of knowledge and to appreciate them. Also, very important, and that's what I alluded first to at the beginning, and that is using asset-based terminology. And as you see, we always say multilingual learners because about a year ago, when RISA had been the first ISD in the state of Michigan, and as far as I know, one of the first in the nations as an ISD to move away from using the deficit-based terminology EL or ELL and instead using multilingual learners. And Kalyn and I are our titles have changed multilingual consultants, and our department is multilingual department. And here is and the reason for that, because words matter. And here is a graphic that shows the continuum of labeling multilingual learners historically. And so if we look at this from the left to the right, from the deficit-based to the asset-based, how many times have you heard somebody saying, this kid is zero English, referring to a child as zero English or no English? And I've actually, even recently, I was reading a document for early childhood, and it referred to those 4-year-old as no English kids. Literally, it says no English kids. So and limited English proficient for many years, for decades. Multilingual learners were called limited English proficient, LEP. And even in the law, you will still find reference to LEP. So that is a very deficit-based, limited, zero, no. And also many districts use the term ESL students, English as second language, even when those students speak 2 and 3 languages. And we know many students, like for example, from the Indian subcontinent, they at least speak 2 languages when they come to the US. Hindi and Malayalam, Hindi and Punjabi or Urdu or whatever. And or in Africa, we have in Western Africa and Nigeria, and we have most students speak at least 2 languages. So by virtue of the name itself, second language is wrong, and because these students do speak at least 2 languages. So it would be English as a third language or fourth language. So it is not an accurate. In addition to, these students already have multiple languages, so why call them by the English as second language? Another one that is still the law is English learner, or sometimes called English language learners. In the state of Michigan, the Board of Education of the state of Michigan, MDE, we do not use English language learners. We only use English learner, even though WIDA refers to the students as English language learner. And that is still not an asset-based terminology, simply because you are referring to those students by what they don't have, i.e. English. What about the languages that they already know? That's why we adopted the most asset-based terminology in the field, which is multilingual learner. And I can tell you that as a member of the NIALPA, the National Association of EL Program Administrators, We have issued a white paper, and we are advocating with the U.S. Department of Ed to have a provision in the law to change the terminology from English learners, English learner to multilingual learner. So I hope that you look at this and ask yourself what terminology I use and where I am on this continuum and where I want to be. Even if your district and does not use the asset-based terminology, you as an educator, where do you want to be? What do you want to advocate? And it always starts with really having us and have the change begin with us. And I'm sure you will have influence on others. I'm teaching a class at Wayne State University, and in the first class, I showed this continuum, and I've seen it from the vast majority of educators from that moment decided to adopt multilingual learners, and since then, that's what they use. So we hope really that we could move on with changing our language because it is important. Unfortunately, I lost my remote slide, so could you please? Okay, thank you. So when it comes to multilingual learners, it's important for us to create a climate of instruction that is based on the success of these students by recognizing their assets and what they bring to the schools and classrooms. All languages and language varieties, not only languages. So we may have dialects that are used by the family as a means of communication at home. And we need to really value and appreciate those language and language varieties. So as educators, we need to ensure that we enrich the students' language development and learning and affirm their identity and enhance their knowledge and intellectual capacity and flexibility in language use in the classroom, and also allow them to interpret and present different perspectives based on their culture, based on the perspectives that they bring in from their culture and from their community, and build awareness of relationships and affirm their identity. Next, please. So all languages are assets, and all languages and language varieties that students and families bring are valuable. Next, please. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much about translanguaging, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with translanguaging, because this is a big issue. It's very important. Multilingual learners use their full linguistic repertoire, including translanguaging practices, to enrich their language development and learning. And next, please. So, the translanguaging is when a multilingual person's full linguistic repertoire is used and honored instead of trying to keep narrowly focused on a single language. So language practices are much more fluid than that of the strict separation of languages that is often demanded in schools. And translanguage is also the way a teacher teaches. It's a pedagogical approach. Using two languages, when we ask a student, for example, a question that is complex and they don't have the English vocabulary to answer that question. They have the knowledge, they have the concept, but they don't have the words. So are we allowing them to have the voice, or we oppress their voice and not allow them to show their knowledge? So this is translanguaging is really a way of having an equitable voice for all students in our classroom. So as I said, we don't want to focus too much on it, but we want you to be aware of it. And hopefully in the near future, we are going to have a presentation or a video that is focusing on the how to utilize translanguaging in the classroom during the instruction. It's a powerful pedagogical approach, and we really need to use this equitable approach in the classroom. Next, please. Okay. So as we mentioned, building relationships with families, and especially multilingual families, is very important to asset-based approach and language-focused approach. So whether it's establishing the language goals, as we said, with the family and the students, instead of forcing goals on them, or using the family's fund of knowledge and use of home language, the native language in the classroom, and or connecting with community resources. And there are plenty of those resources out there that we could connect to them. You could either directly go to the organizations in the community, or ask the family where they go, and what are the community resources that exist out there, or ask the students themselves what do they do when they're not at school, and then you will have a link to those community resources. And also, very important, having meaningful two-way communication in a language families can understand. And I will go over this a little bit in details. And also, when it comes to pedagogy, using the we that can do philosophy, and utilizing all the cultural and linguistic practices and skills and ways of knowing in the classroom is very powerful. Next, please. Okay, so here, as I talked about the ensuring meaningful communication, how to ensure meaningful communication. So school, district, and you as a teacher or educator should use meaningful two-way communication. So when we send a letter to the family, that is only one-way communication. No matter how important that message or that memo or that letter, it is a one-way communication. We need to really create this two-way meaningful communication with the parents, and allow them to have a voice in the process. And also, that communication need to be in a language that parents understand. So if it's only in English, then we are leaving so many parents behind. We are not attending to the needs of the families themselves. I'm not going to talk about having ESL classes for parents, which is so important, and unfortunately we're not doing well in the state. And when it comes to this, there are some community organizations that are providing, and some districts providing ESL classes for parents, but for the most part, we see that those classes are either too far away from newcomer families that who do not have transportation to go there, or at time when those parents are at work or whatever. So we need to ensure that we use a language that the parents understand. And that leads to translation and interpretation of resources. And translation refer to translating documents, whereas interpretation is oral translation using an interpreter who is proficient in both English and the native language. And that is very important, especially if the child has special needs, and that then it becomes an Office of Civil Rights issue to provide those translation and interpretation, and also provide and invite cultural and language brokers. And so if the district has a school liaison or district liaison that speaks the language or the mostly spoken language in that district or in that school, that is great. Excuse me. But what if we don't have a liaison? We could there are many parents who would love to volunteer to be that broker. And so all you have to do is work with the PTA or PTO and ask for volunteer, and you'll be surprised how many would be willing and available to be that broker to help the communication, to help ensuring meaningful communication between the school, the district, and the parents. Next, please. So how do we ensure that the families, the multilingual families, supporting their children at home? These are some activities in the native language that support learning at school, using oral histories and literacy activities, read books, write letters, respond to, with drawings, and make predictions, summarize text, make inferences, cite evidence, analyze text structures. These are some of the activities that in the native language that support learning at school. Whereas in families' participation at school, also the families, the parents, or the siblings, older siblings, can read books in native language or bilingual books. And I remember doing this as a parent in my kids' school, and that was very powerful, and many kids loved it, and many other parents picked up after that, and they start reading, even reading books in English, and it doesn't matter if they have accents or not. And that is part of really inviting and bringing the family into the school, which provide a lot of support to the kids and their learning, bringing home to school. That's what it is. Next, please. Okay, and now we have these two reflection questions on multilingual families. How can I learn about families' language and cultural goals? And what are some activities that I can do with children to ensure, to encourage them to use all of their languages? Think for a few seconds about these two languages while we move on to do a quick activity with Kalyn, but keep those two questions in mind while looking and participating in the next activity.
Hello. So I'm dropping a link in the chat. Since we don't have a lot of time today, on the next slide, I'm actually going to show you the part of the article that we're asking you to skim. But I just did provide it in the chat, and that QR code, which will also be available, of course, when you have the recording, will also lead you directly to this article. So this article has a bunch of guiding principles and bullet points on the first page, and I'm going to show you them on the next slide in a moment. You've gotten a lot of information about assets-based thinking around multilingual students and their families, and I'd like you just to skim those principles on the slide or in the document. Choose one that is resonating with you today, and just think about it a little bit and maybe a one sentence reflection to about what is occurring to you or what connection you're making or how you might implement something in practice or something you've seen. So we're just going to take a moment to pause and at least try to process a little bit about what we're doing here. So these are the guiding principles, which are placed on this slide. And again, you'll find them on the first page of the document as well, but you can look at them right here. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment and just take a moment to reflect and add something to the chat. So for Angela today, use language that humanizes. Good. If anyone wants to drop an example of that too, that's great. If you're not right now, that's all right as well. That is why we're trying to move away from things, especially like zero English, right? But even some other things with the emphasis on English. We want the whole child and all of their background and all of their language and culture there. Intention versus experience is important. Very good. Because in the end, it's your impact, no matter what your intention is. If you're unsure to refer, just ask. Yes, very good. Respectful language. Avoid the idea of us versus them. Good. Connective language. Ask. All this ask stuff. This is really good. And I want something I heard about. I was at the Newcomer Summit, and when we even just talk about learning students' names, someone was talking about, I need to do a little more research on this, but being able, when the student registered, for them to pronounce their name the way they say it and record it. Now, I've done that in the past, but then we've had all sorts of things like QR codes and other things. These people were able to put it right in their local SIS. I believe they had Power School. So when any teacher opened up the student, they could listen to them saying their own name, which I think is brilliant, and we need to make a county and statewide thing. Yes, we got some more things going on about names and asking whether that's about names or other things, avoiding labeling, building relationships, moving beyond generalities. Thank you. Really good things happening in the chat. I'm going to ask you just to let that flow. Unfortunately, due to time, I am going to move on. Oh, and letting students call you out. Yes. A good I'm sorry and a new attempt. You know, I'm fluent in Spanish, for instance, but I cannot roll my R's to save my life, never been able to. And people are very forgiving when you're trying, right? So it's that kind of thing, or correct me or say it, or, you know, what can we do about it? Relationships, not only with students, yes, with entire families. Thank you for lifting that. So now the second part of our presentation is around more research-based best practices, instructional practices to help you, right? So this is not a SciUp course, though we do offer that in person and online. Next cohort in November, plug, shameless plug. But when you think about creating a language-rich and interactive classroom, one of the best research-based models for that is the SciUp model, which stands for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. We are going to be talking about something else that's in a different book called 7 Steps to a Language-Rich Interactive Classroom, and focusing on a few of those. But it really integrates very well with SciUp, and I'm really showing you this to show you all the components and to let you know that the components we're going to be focusing on today are strategies, especially the scaffolding feature of strategies, and interaction, which are very important strategies within SciUp and integrate with what the best practices I'm going to talk about now. So again, we have another QR code. I will drop the link here. This is just for you. Again, this is not a SciUp course, so we won't delve deep, but this will give you all the features and of the components, of the 8 components of SciUp. So 7 steps to a language-rich interactive classroom. So here, take a moment to look over these 7 steps. We are going to mention all of them, but again, due to time, we are really going to focus on 1, 2, 6, and 7. So when we look at this, there's another thing called total participation, or TIPS, that aligns very well with SciUp too. And really steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 all are about that interaction component in SciUp and using total participation techniques out of TIPS. right? When you look at steps 5, 6, and 7, these really tie in with content and language objectives, which are part of the first SIOP component of lesson preparation, as of having structured conversations and structured reading and writing tasks. Those are part of interaction and part of lesson preparation of SIOP components. And if you really look, obviously all of these are important, but if you look at 6 and 7, that is really sort of the point of school and academics, right? Literacy is an indicator of future success, both in our schools and sometimes outside of them as well, right? Or often, I should say, outside of them as well. So if we want to get there, how do we do that? So step 1 here is talking about what students should say instead of saying, I don't know, right? We've all been there when students don't know what to say and then just, give that as an answer. And we're not going to let them do that. We don't want learned helplessness, but also we don't want that kind of anxiety. It's not always learned helplessness. Sometimes it's just the anxiety of feeling like you're being put on the spot. So what 7 steps does in the first step is giving students different responses. You're not allowed to say, I don't know. So what can you say? So if you look at that chart, and there are some other charts with even more brilliant visuals around this topic, but, may I please have some more information? May I please have some time to think? Would you please repeat the question? Where can I find more information about that? Or may I ask a friend for help? All right. So this is going to allow the students, and especially if this is some sort of anchor chart or some sort of visual in the room, or students have them at the beginning of their interactive notebooks, right? It's something that they can always refer back to and make a choice. So take a moment to read. These are actually 2 separate conversations, but read the one on the left and the one on the right, because this is an example of how you would do this when a student says, I don't know. So take a look at the 2 examples with Ahmed. Okay, so every time we ask students to respond to a question or perform a task, we need to hold them accountable. Because if we don't, or we just say, I don't know, and move on to someone else, you're sending a sort of a subliminal message of, I don't expect you to achieve, right? So this is a way to stop that. So if we look there on the right, that question is obviously very much a right there question, right? There's just a simple answer to it. It's not a think and search or an inferential question. But he's able to ask a friend, and then we'll get to step 2, which is speaking in complete sentences, turn that into a complete sentence. So this works at kind of those level 1 knowledge questions, but as you can see by the one on the left, it also works for the a little bit deeper questions, right? What I really like about the one on the left is that it is the other students all have something to do, right? So we're not all just expecting everyone to behave and wait quietly and patiently in their seats while Ahmed is figuring this out. Since this isn't just a quick one, it's like, okay, everyone look at your notes, because what's going to happen is if Ahmed can't find it, Ahmed will also have the opportunity to call on someone else in the class to help them. And Kelly, now the same thing's happened to me. I'm going to have to ask you to advance my slide. I don't know why. I've gone out of the system. Let me just do that manually. Don't know what's up today. Thank you very much. So step 2 is having students speak in complete sentences, right? This is important, both from like a English language development perspective of vocabulary and syntax and such. And also, this is very early. Go back. You were on the correct slide. Go forward. Yeah, right there. The important thing is what we speak, we can write, right? If you ever do emergent literacy, that's very much what happens, but that's really true throughout our entire school career. If you can say it, you can write it. If you write it, you can read it. So if you start speaking this way, it's much easier later to write this way. Would you advance, please? Thank you. So here we have students speaking complete sentences. How do we take advantage of that? We do that by giving them sentence stems or sentence frames to do so. And you see some examples here about, the earth spinning an equation or your opinion, right? So it also helps if someone has anxiety or just doesn't really know where to begin, it helps them get started. And if we also build in some wait time, we'll do some total response signals in just a minute, but if you're building in wait time, as you'll see, you can also have students either like flip a card on something, show something online, give you a thumbs up, do some sort of signal to show they're ready. Like you can even say, okay, place your hand on your ear if you're ready, right? Or flip the card over on your desk when you're ready to complete the sentence. And they can even practice with another student. Go ahead, Kelly. Thank you. So step 3 is part of this is being able to have peer rehearsal. Peer rehearsal is important for a couple of different reasons. One, it stops the teacher from talking. Unfortunately, Khalil and I are talking during this is more like a webinar approach in this Blitz. But really, he who talks or she who talks learns, right? If we were able at the moment to send you to breakout rooms and do some more discussion and some things within yourselves, probably some of these points would be easily more integrated into all of your prior knowledge or with all of your prior knowledge. So we do want students talking and not ourselves so much. And then it also gives them a sort of low key time to practice before maybe speaking before the whole class. So when you do this, there are different ways to choose somebody, right? Everyone's getting language practice to randomize their responses. And there's some that are online like flippity.net where you can import the students' names based on on a Google sheet and things like that. You can also do different kinds of spinners where maybe all the names stay all the time, or maybe when someone answers, their name goes off the spinner, before you do it the next time. And then there are a lot of just, I want to say old-fashioned ways, but, sticky notes, popsicle sticks, other things that you have. I've also had things where if you have a newcomer student or a high anxiety student, maybe they get to own their popsicle stick and they put it in the mix when they feel good about something, in which case I probably would pretend to pull them even if their name wasn't on there. And some people are adding some things to the chat, which we'll take a look at in a moment as well. Kelly, would you go to the next one? Here are some more total response signals. And so when I was talking about cards, like some people will have these colored cards, kind of like based on a stoplight, like needing more time, still thinking is red, right? Kind of in the middle, not sure if I'm ready to go is yellow. And then if I'm ready, the green side of the card is up, or I've placed my green card out or something like that. On the chart there too, which you'll have, if you do get, when you do get the recording, you can look at more closely, but you can have other ideas there. I really like when you're in person to have the whiteboard. So you have a group of students working, but they all have to have maybe the answer to the math problem or whatever on the whiteboard. And when they're ready, they go up, or you call for them to come up at the same time. So they all have time to get with it. Then there are other places to go, like maybe movement, right? If you're going to agree with a certain opinion, go to that corner of the room. If you're going to, agree with something else, go there. Or if what resonates with you today, like I asked, if we were all together, we could have a few of those points up and I could send you different places based on what's resonating with you to involve discussion there. Go ahead, Kelly. So again, these are some typical ones when you're in person, right? Thumbs up, thumbs down, and wiggle your fist. And would you go to the next slide, Kelly? And we're gonna have to go step by step through this. Okay, so I'm gonna give you some statements. You can do it with your little icons on Zoom or not, as you prefer, or if your camera's on, you can just do it. Would you click once, Kelly, and get the statement? So we have some questions, or rather statements, about multilingual learners. So most multilingual learners in the United States, and this is K-12 by the way, speak Spanish as their primary language. True or false? You're also welcome to throw it in the chat. Whatever you like. So go ahead, Kelly. Yes, that is true. 75% of multilingual learners and their families have Spanish as at least one of their native or primary languages. However, if you live in Hamtramck, that's not the case at all, or if you teach there. So obviously you have to know your local community very well, right? So one thing is a nationwide example, and one, it might be the same or very different where you are. Kelly, next statement, please. Most multilingual learners were born outside the United States. Go ahead, Kelly. That is false, right? Most multilingual learners were born in the United States. Oops. She just gave the last one away. So multilingual learners making up 5% of the student population. In Michigan, it's almost true. It's about 6%. But in nationwide, it's 11%. And I really want the newest data to check because it may have gone up by now as well. Thank you. Would you advance to the next slide? So now looking at this again, this is going also back to SIOP for the lesson preparation piece. You have content objectives, which you may know as learning targets, right? They're basically what do you want the child to achieve in this lesson as far as content, or maybe it's a process like a reading process, like citing evidence or something like that there. And then the language objective can be complicated if you're not used to it at first. Because what you're trying to do is, what are the linguistic demands in this lesson? What language do I want the children to understand and to be able to use in this lesson? And then how can I support them? So since we don't have a lot of time to go in this, a great researcher and teacher and author, Dr. Carol Sava on this, blew my mind this year when she basically said to us all, if you have a sentence stem, you have a language objective. So I'm going to leave you with that today. Obviously, it can get more in depth and more complicated than that, but just as a starting out point, if you are asking students to use a sentence stem or a sentence frame, you have a language objective. Okay, go on, Kelly. Here are some examples of content objectives, and what I like is how they are just so beautifully illustrated. And you can see from analyze to retell. Some, we're going to look at language objective verbs in just a second. Go ahead, Kelly, to the next slide. And as you can see, some of these could also be content objectives, which is also why this can get complicated. But this will give you another idea there. Would you go on to the next one? So now we're going into step 6, which is really related to the interaction component of SIOP. We're talking about structured conversations. So again, this will be using sentence stems and frames to help students actually use academic language. And that would be all of your students, because people do not go home and start saying, I want to tell you all about the water cycle and precipitation. Most children do not. So this is also good for just learning academic English for everybody. Would you go on to the next one, Kelly? So QSSSA or QSSSA is a wonderful way to have a structured conversation. And as you can see, you have the steps right there. The teacher's going to ask a question, and that should be an open-ended question, not just a yes or no, or that George Washington one we saw earlier. And students are going to have time to think about how they're going to complete the sentence stem or provide an answer, and they're going to have some sort of signal to show when they're ready. When they are ready, in step 3, they're going to rehearse with a partner or a small group. It may depend on what you're doing that day, and they get to practice with it. Then when everybody feels ready, that's when a teacher may randomly assess. And they could do this in a couple ways too, besides just the popsicle sticks or the flippity.net grid, or spinning wheel, to call on somebody. When I call on you, like if I call on my lovely colleague Kelly, I could ask her to share her answer, or I could ask her to share Khalil's answer, right? So that's another way to do it as far as lowering anxiety and helping students out in this way. Go on, Kelly, because we have a nice example on the next slide. So here is an example from math. And as you can see, we have a content objective about place value, about what's greater than and less than, looking at numbers, right? We have a sample language objective on the left there. And as you can see, that includes even the sentence frames that we're going to be using. Right, that a number is greater than another number because, or is less than, or is equal to, right, with the because. Again, if you had newcomers, you could even just cut that off right before the reasoning. You could say 19 is greater than 12 or whatever it is, right? Or if you're with older students, 3,105 is greater than 3,016 or whatever, looking at different numbers of place value. So there we have a couple of questions from the QSSA, and one would be, what sign would you put and why? And how do you know which number is greater? And so students would be thinking about this. They would practice. When they're ready to go, they could put their thumbs up or whatever signal you've decided on. And they have stems to use. And numbered heads is just a way of numbering off previous to the class to kind of participate in these group activities and so forth. So think about your own grade level and subject area and different ways that you could use this. Kelly, next slide, please. Finally, step 7 is about structured writing. So there's a couple different ways to do this as well. This one is by giving a sentence stem at a time. So if you really wanted to have students write an answer, even a paragraph, would you go back one, Kelly, to the math slide? This is not the best example for a paragraph, but since we have it on the slide, you could start with a student, starting with that sentence, even with the question and restating that as the beginning of a paragraph, right? This is what you do to decide which number is greater than the next or something, right? And then I would write, for example, I would write 12 is less than 19 because, you could even, as you do one at a time, have the students talk about it and then write it. And then you end up with either just a structured sentence or a structured paragraph, depending on what your aim is at that moment. Kelly, would you go to the next slide again? And that's what this is talking about. So again, if you speak it, you can write it. If you write it, you can read it and all of that. So if the student has the frame to speak in a complete sentence, then they can jot it down. If they have trouble with that, they can record themselves first and then listen to the recording and jot it down. Kelly, next slide, please. So, wow. Thank you for dropping that in there. This is, we were so worried about time, and I can't believe how well we're doing. Maybe I should have gone a little more slowly. It's 3:53. We really would like to share these two resources for you, and I've placed them together on a document that goes to that QR code, and I believe it's what Khalil just dropped in the chat as well. And you'll have two things, this slide and the next. It's from a book called EL Excellence Every Day. And a lot of the time we talk about scaffolds, and we also, I'm sure, even without learning about multilingual learners and even your college education, you are probably being told, yeah, sometimes you scaffold, sometimes you have to increase it, and then you eventually want to decrease it, and they're totally independent. And in theory, that just sounds beautiful, and it is. But sometimes it's kind of hard to know in practice, am I scaffolding too much? When do I release? That's always, it's been difficult for me throughout my career, but especially in the beginning. I think I scaffolded, I didn't take the scaffolds away soon enough, right? I always wanted to provide them. So this kind of chart, I think, really helps to know when you want to be increasing the supports that you're giving and when you want to decrease. And they give some very good examples if you'd like to look there. Khalil, I don't know if you want to jump in or piggyback on any of that.
I'm fine.
Okay. Just checking out. And again, they are using English Learner throughout this book, and we substitute, of course, Multilingual Learner, as you know. So I could give you an idea, and you have a link to that resource as well. Kelly, would you go to the last slide? This is also from that book. Now, what we like about this chart here is, again, we have content learning and language learning. And these are great questions to ask yourself for about sort of each stage, right? From when you're setting the goals, including the content and language objectives, what you're doing as the lesson is going on, what kind of scaffolding or supports you might have to in both areas, and then reflecting afterwards. So if you just take a moment to look at this, if you'd like to drop something in the chat, you may. So again, the biggest difference is that in the content learning, we're going to be trying to keep the cognitive level high and the content objective on grade level. And for language learning, that's where, depending on a student's English language proficiency level, you might have more supports or more linguistic accommodations for certain students than for others.
And when it comes to multilingual education, we have always to think, and that's why we always have content objective and learning objectives, because the essence of multilingual education is to make content accessible and comprehensible to the students, and at the same time develop the English language proficiency of the students. So the scaffolding and how to gauge that scaffolding, the whole purpose of it is to really support those multilingual learners in getting the content and developing the language, the English language skills. And the scaffolding may look like a matrix. The students may come with the conceptual understanding of the content itself, but their language needs to be still scaffolded. So it is not always aligned. The content may need more scaffolding than the language, or vice versa. We need to really be juggling these two at the same time. And it comes with practice, and that's why it's called best practice, because it has been practiced a lot, and adjustment happens all the time, and it has to be individual. So if I have a group of students with different English language proficiency in the classroom, my lesson preparation should reflect that, should reflect how much scaffolding I should do to develop the meaning and conceptual understanding, and how much scaffolding and support I have for the students to develop their English language skills.
Absolutely. And when you're thinking about the different kind of language supports, for instance, just one quick example, if you were doing a compare contrast, you might have a student at a lower English language proficiency level writing something like, this is this, but that is that. This is this, and that is that. And you might have another student saying, similarly, on the other hand, right, and changing what their frames are. But even if you're using a ton of visuals for that student with a lower English language proficiency, the one who's higher, the visuals still might help them as well. And if they don't need them, they're not interfering with their learning, right? So, certain things like that that support content, yes, just incorporate them, and they can be good for everybody.
Next, Kelly, please. Okay.
Thank you.
If we have any questions, we would love, we don't have that much time, but we could take a couple of questions if anyone would like to ask.
And we have a nice thing in the chat about looking at all the language domains, because you can leverage a language domain that a student is more proficient in and then scaffold the others around that one. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Always think about all 4 domains. Reading, writing, listening, and speaking all the time.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And we hope that you have gained something from this presentation. And stay tuned.
Oh, and just like Khalil was talking about wanting to make a video around translanguaging, we also started, I was reaching out in particular for the QSSSA, and my colleagues were on other matters. We want to create some little mini videos with some work from students and teachers in Wayne County to show this, happening in practice as well.
We're going to call them micro PDs.
Exactly. So another shameless plug of things to come from Wayne Risa.
The micro PD is coming.
Use